Photograph a historic site, help Wikipedia, and win a prize. Participate in the world's largest photography competition this month. Learn more. Literary criticism. 74 languages. For the event, see Literary Criticism, UIL. This article needs additional citations for verification. Please help improve this article by adding citations to reliable sources. Unsourced material may be challenged and removed. Find sources: Literary Criticism, News, Times Newspapers, Times Books, Times Scholar, Times Gster, April 2016. Learn how and when to remove this message. A genre of arts criticism. Literary criticism or literary studies is the study, evaluation, and interpretation of literature. Modern literary criticism is often influenced by literary theory, which is the philosophical analysis of literature's goals and methods. Although the two activities are closely related, literary critics are not always, and have not always been, theorists. Whether or not literary criticism should be considered a separate field of inquiry from literary theory is a matter of some controversy. For example, the Johns Hopkins Guide to Literary Theory and Criticism, 1, draws no distinction between literary theory and literary criticism, and almost always uses the terms together to describe the same concept. Some critics consider literary criticism a practical application of literary theory, because criticism always deals directly with particular literary works, while theory may be more general or abstract. Literary criticism is often published in essay or book form. Academic literary critics teach in literature departments and publish in academic journals, and more popular critics publish their reviews in broadly circulating periodicals such as the Times Literary Supplement, the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, the Dublin Review of Books, the Nation, Book Forum, and the New Yorker. History, edit. Classical and Medieval Criticism, edit. Explore our developer-friendly HTML to PDF API printed using PDF Crowd HTML to PDF. Literary criticism is thought to have existed as far back as the classical period. 2. In the 4th century BC, Aristotle wrote the Poetics, a typology and description of literary forms with many specific criticisms of contemporary works of art. Poetics developed for the first time the concepts of mimesis and catharsis, which are still crucial in literary studies. Plato's attacks on poetry as imitative, secondary, and false were formative as well. The Sanskrit Natya Shastra includes literary criticism on ancient Indian literature and Sanskrit drama. Later classical and medieval criticism often focused on religious texts, and the several long religious traditions of hermeneutics and textual exegesis have had a profound influence on the study of secular texts. This was particularly the case for the literary traditions of the three Abrahamic religions: Jewish literature, Christian literature, and Islamic literature. Literary criticism was also employed in other forms of medieval Arabic literature and Arabic poetry. From the 9th century, notably by Al-Jahiz in his Al-Bayan wa al-Tabi'in and Al-Hayawan, and by Abdullah ibn al-Mutaz in his Kitab al-Badi. 3. Renaissance criticism, edit. The literary criticism of the Renaissance developed classical ideas of unity of form and content into literary neoclassicism, proclaiming literature as central to culture, entrusting the poet and the author with preservation of a long literary tradition. The birth of Renaissance criticism was in 1498, with the recovery of classic texts, most notably, Giorgio Vala's Latin translation of Aristotle's Poetics. The work of Aristotle, especially Poetics, was the most important influence upon literary criticism until the late 18th century. Lodovico Castelvetro was one of the most influential Renaissance critics who wrote commentaries on Aristotle's Poetics in 1570. Baroque criticism, edit. The 17th century witnessed the first full-fledged crisis in modernity of the core critical aesthetic principles inherited from classical antiquity, such as proportion, harmony, unity, decorum, that had long governed, guaranteed, and stabilized Western thinking about artworks. For, although classicism was very far from spent as a cultural force, it was to be gradually challenged by a rival movement, namely Baroque, that favored the transgressive and the extreme, without laying claim to the unity, harmony, or decorum that supposedly distinguished both nature and its greatest imitator, namely ancient art. The key concepts of the Baroque aesthetic, such as conceit, concetto, wit, acutezza, ingegno, and wonder, meraviglia, were not fully developed in literary theory until the publication of Emanuele Tesoro's Il Canocchiale Aristotelico, the Aristotelian telescope, in 1654. This seminal treatise, inspired by Giambattista Marino's Epicodone and the work of the Spanish Jesuit philosopher Baltasar Gracian, developed a theory of metaphor as a universal language of images and as a supreme intellectual act, at once an artifice and an epistemologically privileged mode of access to truth. Explore our developer-friendly HTML to PDF API printed using PDF Crowd HTML to PDF. Samuel Johnson, one of the most influential writers and critics of the 18th century. C. Samuel Johnson's Literary Criticism. Enlightenment criticism, edit. In the Enlightenment period, 1700s-1800s, literary criticism became more popular. During this time literacy rates started to rise in the public. 5. No longer was reading exclusive for the wealthy or scholarly. With the rise of the literate public, the swiftness of printing and commercialization of literature, criticism arose too. 6. Reading was no longer viewed solely as educational or as a sacred source of religion, it was a form of entertainment. 7. Literary criticism was influenced by the values and stylistic writing, including clear, bold, precise writing and the more controversial criteria of the author's religious beliefs. 8. These critical reviews were published in many magazines, newspapers, and journals. The commercialization of literature and its mass production had its downside. The emergent literary market, which was expected to educate the public and keep them away from superstition and prejudice, increasingly diverged from the idealistic control of the Enlightenment theoreticians, so that the business of enlightenment became a business with the Enlightenment. 9. This development, particularly of emergence of entertainment literature, was addressed through an intensification of criticism. 9. Many works of Jonathan Swift, for instance, were criticized, including his book Gulliver's Travels, which one critic described as the detestable story of the Yahoos. 8. 19th century Romantic criticism, edit. The British Romantic movement of the early 19th century introduced new aesthetic ideas to Literary studies, including the idea that the object of literature need not always be beautiful, noble, or perfect, but that literature itself could elevate a common subject to the level of the sublime. German Romanticism, which followed closely after the late development of German classicism, emphasized an aesthetic of fragmentation that can appear startlingly modern to the reader of English literature, and valued wits, that is, wit or humor of a certain sort, more highly than the serious Anglophone Romanticism. The late 19th century brought renown to authors known more for their literary criticism than for their own literary work, such as Matthew Arnold. The New Criticism, edit. However important all of these aesthetic movements were as antecedents, current ideas about literary criticism derive almost entirely from the new direction taken in the early 20th century. Early in the century, the school of criticism known as Russian formalism, and slightly later the new Explore our developer-friendly HTML to PDF API printed using PDF Crowd HTML to PDF. Ferdinand de Saussure's theories of linguistics and semiotics were influential in developing structuralist approach to literary criticism. Criticism in Britain and in the United States came to dominate the study and discussion of literature. In the English-speaking world, both schools emphasized the close reading of texts, elevating it far above generalizing discussion and speculation about either authorial intention, to say nothing of the author's psychology or biography, which became almost taboo subjects, or reader response. This emphasis on form and precise attention to the words themselves has persisted, after the decline of these critical doctrines themselves. Citation needed. Theory, edit. In 1957 Northrop Frye published the influential Anatomy of Criticism. In his works Frye noted that some critics tend to embrace an ideology, and to judge literary pieces on the basis of their adherence to such ideology. This has been a highly influential viewpoint among modern conservative thinkers. E. Michael Jones, for example, argues in his Degenerate Moderns that Stanley Fish was influenced by his own adulterous affairs to reject classic literature that condemned adultery. 10. Jürgen Habermas, in Erkenntnis und Interesse, 1968, Knowledge and Human Interests, described literary critical theory in literary studies as a form of hermeneutics, knowledge via interpretation to understand the meaning of human texts and symbolic expressions, including the interpretation of texts which themselves interpret other texts. In the British and American literary establishment, the new criticism was more or less dominant until the late 1960s. Around that time, Anglo-American university literature departments began to witness a rise of a more explicitly philosophical literary theory, influenced by structuralism, then post-structuralism, and other kinds of continental philosophy. It continued until the mid-1980s, when interest in theory peaked. Many later critics, though undoubtedly still influenced by theoretical work, have been comfortable simply interpreting literature rather than writing explicitly about methodology and philosophical presumptions. Current state, edit. Today, approaches based in literary theory and continental philosophy largely coexist in university literature departments, while conventional methods, some informed by the new critics, also remain active. Disagreements over the goals and methods of literary criticism, which characterized both sides taken by Critics during the rise of theory have declined. Explore our developer-friendly HTML to PDF API printed using PDF Crowd HTML to PDF. Some critics work largely with theoretical texts, while others read traditional literature. Interest in the literary canon is still great, but many critics are also interested in non-traditional texts and women's literature, as elaborated on by certain academic journals such as Contemporary Women's Writing. 11. While some critics influenced by cultural studies read popular texts like comic books or pulp/genre fiction, eco-critics have drawn connections between literature and the natural sciences. Darwinian literary studies studies literature in the context of evolutionary influences on human nature. And post-critique has sought to develop new ways of reading and responding to literary texts that go beyond the interpretive methods of critique. Many literary critics also work in film criticism or media studies. History of the book, edit. Related to other forms of literary criticism, the history of the book is a field of interdisciplinary inquiry, drawing on the methods of bibliography, cultural history, history of literature, and media theory. Principally concerned with the production, circulation, and reception of texts and their material forms, book history seeks to connect forms of textuality with their material aspects. Among the issues within the history of literature with which book history can be seen to intersect are the development of authorship as a profession, the formation of reading audiences, the constraints of censorship and copyright, and the economics of literary form. Major 20th century schools of critical analysis, edit. Historicist approaches. New historicism. Formalist approaches. Russian formalism. Narratology. Structuralism. Post-structuralism. Deconstructionism. Literary modernism. Postmodernism. Reader response criticism. Semiotic literary criticism. New criticism. Genre studies. Hermeneutics. Political approaches. Explore our developer-friendly HTML to PDF API printed using PDF Crowd HTML to PDF. Marxist literary criticism. Cultural studies. Post-colonialism. Feminist literary criticism. Eco-criticism. Psychological approaches. Archetypal literary criticism. Phenomenology. Psychoanalytic literary criticism. New humanism. Race and sexuality approaches. African American literature. Queer theory. Critical race theory. Affect theory. Disability studies. Key texts, edit. Further information, critical theory, feminist literary criticism, and list of American literary critics. Classical and medieval periods, edit. Plato, Ion, Republic, Cratylus. Aristotle, Poetics, Rhetoric. Horace, Art of Poetry. Longinus, On the Sublime. Plotinus, On the Intellectual Beauties. Saint Augustine, On Christian Doctrine. Boethius, The Consolation of Philosophy. Aquinas, The Nature and Domain of Sacred Doctrine. Dante, The Banquet, Letter to Cangrande della Scala. Boccaccio, Life of Dante, Genealogy of the Gentile Gods. Christine de Pizan, The Book of the City of Ladies. Bharatamuni, Natya Shastra. Rajashekara, Inquiry into Literature. Valmiki, The Invention of Poetry, from the Ramayana. Anandavahana, Light on Suggestion. Explore our developer-friendly HTML to PDF API printed using PDF Crowd HTML to PDF. Cowpie, a discourse on literature. Luigi, rhyme prose on literature. Luzai, the literary mind. Wang Changuling, a discussion of literature and meaning. Saikong Tu, the 24 classes of poetry. Renaissance period, edit. Lodovico Castelvetro, the Poetics of Aristotle translated and explained. Philip Sidney, an apology for poetry. Jacopo Mazzoni, on the defense of the comedy of Dante. Torquato Tasso, discourses on the heroic poem. Francis Bacon, the advancement of learning. Henry Reynolds, Mythomists. John Mandeville, composed in the mid-14th century most probably by a French physician. Enlightenment period, edit. Thomas Hobbes, answer to Davenant's preface to Gondibet. Pierre Corneille, of the three unities of action, time, and place. John Dryden, an essay of dramatic poesy. Nicola Spoglio d'Esprio, The Art of Poetry. John Locke, an essay concerning human understanding. John Dennis, The Advancement and Reformation of Modern Poetry. Alexander Pope, an essay on criticism. Joseph Addison, On the Pleasures of the Imagination, Spectator Essays. Giambattista Vico, The New Science. Edmund Burke, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful. David Hume, Of the Standard of Taste. Samuel Johnson, On Fiction, Rasselas, Preface to Shakespeare. Edward Young, Conjectures on Original Composition. Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, Laocoon. Joshua Reynolds, Discourses on Art. Richard Conversation Sharp Letters and Essays in Prose and Verse. James Usher, Clio, or A Discourse on Taste, 1767, 12. Denis Diderot, The Paradox of Acting. Immanuel Kant, Critique of Judgment. Mary Wollstonecraft. A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Explore our developer-friendly HTML to PDF API printed using PDF Crowd HTML to PDF. William Blake, The Marriage of Heaven or Hell, Letter to Thomas Butts, Annotations to Reynolds Discourses, a descriptive catalogue, a vision of the Last Judgment, on Homer's poetry. Friedrich Schiller, Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man. Friedrich Schlegel, Critical Fragments, Athenaeum Fragments, on Incomprehensibility. 19th Century, edit. John Neal, American Writers, 13. William Wordsworth, Preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads. Anne-Louise Germain Dostal, Literature in its Relation to Social Institutions. Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, On the Relation of the Plastic Arts to Nature. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Shakespeare's Judgment Equal to His Genius, On the Principles of Genial Criticism, The Statesman's Manual, Biographia Literaria. Wilhelm von Humboldt, Collected Works. John Keats, Letters to Benjamin Bailey, George and Thomas Keats, John Taylor, and Richard Woodhouse. Arthur Schopenhauer, The World as Will and Idea. Thomas Love Peacock, The Four Ages of Poetry. Percy Bysshe Shelley, A Defense of Poetry. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Conversations with Eckermann, Maxim No. 279. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, The Philosophy of Fine Art. Giacomo Leopardi, Zibaldone, Notebooks. Francesco de Sanctis, Critical Essays, History of the Italian Literature. Thomas Carlyle, Symbols. John Stuart Mill. What is Poetry? Ralph Waldo Emerson, The Poet. Charles Augustin Sainte-Beuve, What is a Classic? James Russell Lowell, A Fable for Critics. Edgar Allan Poe, The Poetic Principle. Matthew Arnold, Preface to the 1853 edition of Poems, The Function of Criticism at the Present Time, The Study of Poetry. Hippolyte Taine, History of English Literature and Language. Charles Baudelaire, The Salon of 1859. Karl Marx, The German Ideology, Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Søren Kierkegaard, Two Ages, A Literary Review, The Concept of Irony. Friedrich Nietzsche, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, Truth and Falsity in an Ultramoral Sense. Explore our developer-friendly HTML to PDF API printed using PDF Crowd HTML to PDF. Walter Pater, Studies in the History of the Renaissance. Émile Zola, The Experimental Novel. Anatole France, The Adventures of the Soul. Oscar Wilde, The Decay of Lying. Stefan Malm, The Evolution of Literature, the book, A Spiritual Mystery, Mystery in Literature. Leo Tolstoy, What is Art? 20th Century, edit. Benedetto Cruz, Aesthetic. Antonio Gramsci, Prison Notebooks. Umberto Eco, The Aesthetics of Thomas Aquinas, The Open Work. A. C. Bradley, Poetry for Poetry's Sake. Sigmund Freud, Creative Writers and Daydreaming. Ferdinand de Saussure, Course in General Linguistics. Claude Lévi-Strauss, The Structural Study of Myth. T. E. Hume, Romanticism and Classicism, Bergson's Theory of Art. Walter Benjamin, On Language as Such and on the Language of Man. Victor Shklovsky, Art as Technique. T. S. Eliot, Tradition and the Individual Talent, Hamlet and His Problems. Irving Babbitt, Romantic Melancholy. Carl Jung, On the Relation of Analytical Psychology to Poetry. Leon Trotsky, The Formalist School of Poetry and Marxism. Boris Eichenbaum, The Theory of the Formal Method. Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. Aya Richards, Practical Criticism. Mikhail Bakhtin, Epic and Novel, Toward a Methodology for the Study of the Novel. Georges Bataille, The Notion of Expenditure. John Crow Ransom. Poetry, A Note in Ontology, Criticism as Pure Speculation. R. P. Blackmer, A Critic's Job of Work. Jacques Lacan, The Mirror Stage as Formative of the Function of the Eye as Revealed in Psychoanalytic Experience, The Agency of the Letter in the Unconscious or Reason Since. Freud. Georgy Lukács, The Ideal of the Harmonious Man in Bourgeois Aesthetics, Art and Objective Truth. Paul Valery, Poetry and Abstract Thought. Kenneth Burke, Literature as Equipment for Living. Explore our developer-friendly HTML to PDF API printed using PDF Crowd HTML to PDF. Ernst Cassirer, Art. W. K. Wimsatt and Monroe Beardsley, The Intentional Fallacy, The Affective Fallacy. Cleanth Brooks, The Heresy of Paraphrase, Irony as a Principle of Structure. Jan Mukovsk, Standard Language and Poetic Language. Jean-Paul Sartre, Why Write? Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex. Ronald Crane, Toward a More Adequate Criticism of Poetic Structure. Philip Wheelwright, The Burning Fountain. Theodore Adorno, Cultural Criticism and Society, Aesthetic Theory. Roman Jakobson, The Metaphoric and Metonymic Poles. Northrop Frye, Anatomy of Criticism, The Critical Path. Gaston Bachelard, The Poetics of Space. Ernst Gumbrich, Art and Illusion. Martin Heidegger, The Nature of Language, Language in the Poem, Hölderlin and the Essence. of poetry. E.D. Hirsch Jr., Objective Interpretation. Noam Chomsky, Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. Jacques Derrida, Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. Roland Barthes, The Structuralist Activity, The Death of the Author. Michel Foucault, Truth and Power, What is an Author? The Discourse on Language. Hans Robert Josse, Literary History as a Challenge to Literary Theory. Georges Poulet, Phenomenology of Reading. Raymond Williams, The Country and the City. Lionel Trilling, The Liberal Imagination. Julia Kristeva, From One Identity to Another, Women's Time. Paul de Man, Semiology and Rhetoric, The Rhetoric of Temporality. Harold Bloom, The Anxiety of Influence, The Dialectics of Poetic Tradition, Poetry, Revisionism. Repression. Chinua Achebe, Colonialist Criticism. Stanley Fish, Normal Circumstances, Literal Language, Direct Speech Acts, The Ordinary, the Everyday, the Obvious, What Goes Without Saying, and Other Special Cases. Is there a text in this class? Edward Said, The World, The Text, and the Critic, Secular Criticism. Elaine Showalter, Toward a Feminist Poetics. Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, Infection in the Sentence, The Madwoman in the Attic. Murray Krieger, A Waking Dream, The Symbolic Alternative to Allegory. Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. Explore our developer-friendly HTML to PDF API printed using PDF Crowd HTML to PDF. René Girard, The Sacrificial Crisis. Helen Sixus, The Laugh of the Medusa. Jonathan Culler, Beyond Interpretation. Jeffrey Hartman, Literary Commentary as Literature. Wolfgang Iser, The Repertoire. Hayden White, The Historical Text as Literary Artifact. Hans-Georg Gadamer, Truth and Method. Paul Ricoeur, The Metaphorical Process as Cognition, Imagination, and Feeling. Peter Sondy, On Textual Understanding. M. H. Abrams, How to Do Things with Texts. J. Hillis Miller, The Critic as Host. Clifford Geertz, Blurred Genres, The Refiguration of Social Thought. Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, The Foundation and Manifesto of Futurism. Tristan Serra, Unpretentious Proclamation. André Breton, The Surrealist Manifesto, The Declaration of the 27th of January, 1925. Mina Lowy, Feminist Manifesto. Yoko Mitsurugichi, Sensation and New Sensation. Oswald de Andrade, Cannibalist Manifesto. André Breton, Leon Trotsky and Diego Rivera, Manifesto, Towards a Free Revolutionary Art. Hushi, Some Modest Proposals for the Reform of Literature. Octavio Paz, The Bow and the Leary. See also, edit. Book Review. Comparative Literature. Critical Lens. Genre Studies. History of the Book. Literary Critics. Literary Translation. Philosophy and Literature. Poetic Tradition. Social Criticism. Translation Criticism. References, edit. 1. The Johns Hopkins Guide to Literary Theory and Criticism, 2nd ed. Baltimore, M.D., Johns. Explore our developer-friendly HTML to PDF API printed using PDF Crowd HTML to PDF. Hopkins University Press. 2005. ISBN 978-0-8018-8010-0. OCLC 54374476. 2. Literary Theory Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Archived from the original on 27 November 2020. Retrieved 1 December 2020. 3 Van Gelder, G.J.H. 1982. Beyond the Line, Classical Arabic Literary Critics on the Coherence and Unity of the Poem. Leiden, Brill Publishers. pp. 1-2. ISBN 978-90-04-06854-4. OCLC 10350183. 4 John R. Snyder, L'Estetica del Barocco, Bologna, Il Mulino, 2005, 21-22. 5 Van Horn Melton, James, 2001. The Rise of the Public in Enlightenment Europe. Cambridge, UK. Cambridge University Press. p. 82. ISBN 978-0-521-46573-1. 6 Voskuhl, Adelheid, 2013. Androids in the Enlightenment, Mechanics, Artisans, and Cultures of the Self. Chicago, University of Chicago Press. pp. 71-72. ISBN 978-0-226-03402-7. 7 Murray, Stuart, 2009. The Library, An Illustrated History. New York, Skyhorse. pp. 132133. ISBN 978-1-61608-453-0. OCLC 277203534. 8 A. B. Regan, Sean, Dawson, Books, 2013. Reading 1759, Literary Culture in Mid-18th Century. Britain and France. Louisbourg, Pardot, Bucknell University Press. pp. 125130. ISBN 978-1-61148-478-6. 9 A. B. Hohendel, Peter Awet, Bergen, Klaus L. 1988. A History of German Literary Criticism, 173. 1980. Lincoln, University of Nebraska Press. p. 25. ISBN 978-0-8032-7232-3. 10 Jones, E. Michael, 1991. Degenerate Moderns, Modernity as Rationalized Sexual Misbehavior. San Francisco, Ignatius Press. pp. 79-84. ISBN 978-0-89870-447-1. OCLC 28241358. 11 Contemporary Women's Writing Oxford Academic. OUP Academic. Archived from the original. On 7 August 2019. Retrieved 1 August 2019. 12 Usher, J. 1767. Clio or, A Discourse on Taste, addressed to a young lady. Davies. p. 3. Retrieved 10 October 2014. 13 Davis, Theo, 2007. Formalism, Experience, and the Making of American Literature in the 19th Century. New York, Cambridge University Press. p. 69. ISBN 9781139466561. External links, edit. Literary Criticism at the Encyclopaedia Britannica. Dictionary of the History of Ideas, Literary Criticism. Vince Bruton. Literary Theory. Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Jose Angel Garcia Landa. A Bibliography of Literary Theory, Criticism and Philology. Internet Public Library, Literary Criticism collection of critical and biographical websites. How to do literary analysis, an experimental reflection based on the yellow wallpaper. Truman Capote Award for Literary Criticism Award winners. Richards, I. 1928, Principles of Literary Criticism. United States, Harcourt, Brace and Company. Categories: Literary Criticism, Aesthetics, Interpretation, Philosophy, New Criticism. Explore our developer-friendly HTML to PDF API printed using PDF Crowd HTML to PDF.